Radio Westeros, Episode 92, The Free Folk.
Spoilers all books.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Radio Westeros. I'm Yolkboy, and with me as always is Lady Gwyn.
Hi there, listeners. Today we have an episode for you all about the Free Folk. In previous episodes, we've covered the First Men, Andals, Mroynar, and we recently released a two-parter on the Night's Watch. But there's one obvious group that we still needed to focus on. The Free Folk are a massive part of the A Song of Ice and Fire world, so it's time we covered life north of the Wall.
When planning this episode, it soon became obvious that, like our Night's Watch double-header, we needed to split it into two parts. And so today we'll focus on the history and culture of the Free Folk, while the second part will cover the plot leading up to the dramatic action at the Wall as Mance Rayder's host goes to war with the Night's Watch.
So today we start with Free Folk history. Once upon a time, there was no wall separating the North, so what was life like back then? But thousands of years ago, the others came from the far north during the long night. What was life like up north at that time? And what happened in the aftermath to separate the far northerners? Why did the proto-Free Folk find themselves cordoned off from the rest of Westeros?
Next, we'll look at Free Folk culture. What values do they hold in a society that doesn't kneel to royalty, even in the era of a king beyond the wall? How does living lawlessly shape their behaviour and traditions? What are the pros and cons of their lifestyle compared with living in the Westerosi North?
And we'll also take a close look at the different clans, from bronze-clad Thens to the shoeless Hornfoot men to cannibalistic Ice River clan. We'll tell you about igloo builders, walrus bone chariots, cavemen, and lesser-known religions and ways of life.
Then we'll consider some of the characters that make the Free Folk so memorable. Special attention will be given to Mance Rayder and Craster, two sides of the coin of living with absolute freedom. We'll also discuss Tormund and Egret's roles in the cast of characters Jon Snow grows close to during his mission to infiltrate the collected host. Finally, we'll cover the Free Folk's role in the story from a meta perspective. Why did George include them in his world? All of this and more in our first ever look at the Free Folk.
And before we begin, we want to say a big thank you to all of our patrons who keep Radio Westeros going, including our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patron, Peter, and Palace Milkglass patrons, Alex, Aka and the Company of the Cats, Chris B, The Song of Ice, Seth, Kelly, Sister Winter, Moltude, MT Walls, first of his name, and John Workarian, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, The Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jib Jab Hot Dog Shop. House motto, we forge the chains we wear in life.
And if you want to help keep Radio Westeros strong, please consider becoming a patron of the show by visiting patreon.com/Radio Westeros. In return, there's the chance to gain ad-free access to episodes up to a week before they go public, as well as exclusive content, personalised shoutouts, and more. And with all that said, now let's head to the northern fringes. It's time to venture beyond the wall.
In the lands beyond the wall live the diverse people, all descended from the First Men, that we of the more civilized South name wildlings. This is not a term they use themselves. The largest and most numerous of the various peoples beyond the wall named themselves the Free Folk, and their belief that their savage customs allow them lives of greater freedom than the kneelers of the South. And it is true that they live with neither lords nor kings and need bow to neither man nor priest, regardless of their birth or blood or station.
Somewhere in the vague timeline of 8 to 12,000 years ago, the first men up sticks and left Essos, crossed the Arm of Dawn and attempted to settle in Westeros. There were apparently no other human groups residing in the continent that far back, in the historical period known as the Dawn Age. However, there were other intelligent species inhabiting the area, the children of the forest and the giants.
The children required forests for their habitat, and the first men needed to fell trees for their farmland, so it wasn't long before conflict arose. Afraid of the children's ability to spy through their weirwood trees, the first men began to cut down and burn those trees specifically. Viewing these actions as sacrilegious, the children took great offense and fought back, leading to an all-out war between the two species.
Over the course of many years, the first men overcame their diminutive foes, driving them ever further north. With the first men's population rising and the children's falling, the writing was on the wall. This was a war the children couldn't hope to win. In their desperation, their Greenseal leaders called forth the Hammer of the Waters twice, an epic cataclysm of water said to have smashed the Arm of Dawn and created the swamps of the Neck that separate the north of Westeros from the south. While the former attempt was successful, the latter ultimately failed, although the Neck would prove to be a formidable barrier against future land-based invasions of the north from the south.
Perhaps the children's plan was to separate Westeros at the Neck and take the north for themselves, but ultimately first men settled the crannies of the Neck and spread all over the north regardless. Retreating to ever more obscure regions of the map, the children would have to find a way to live alongside the first men or face extinction. Fortunately, the two sides were able to strike a peace called the Pact, which saw the humans take much of the land of Westeros in return for preserving forested areas for the children, with the promise to cease felling the weirwood trees. The agreement was sealed on the Isle of Faces, and thousands of years of peace followed.
With no existential war to worry about, the first men continued to settle areas all around Westeros. Just as human migration spread to all corners of the globe in our world, perhaps as a result of our natural impulse to explore, so did human settlements in Westeros spread to the far reaches of the north, adapting to the landscape and weather, creating subcultures with traditions still honoured thousands of years later.
This was a time before the raising of the wall, when there was no barrier to separate the far north from what would become Stark territory, and the only factor preventing groups of first men settling farther and farther north up to what is now known as the Lands of Always Winter were natural restrictions such as the harsh climate and the ability to find sustenance. Still, in our world, humans have adapted successfully to inhospitable surroundings and developed ways of life that defy the odds. In fact, there are a few areas of the map where people haven't been able to settle. And so we'd expect to find first men settled all over the far north, living in any place that could support life.
The earliest indication on the timeline that first men had settled in the northern extremities comes from the World Book. On the subject of the ancient Long Night, which is said to have occurred approximately 8,000 years ago, we get this in a sidebar. Archmaester Formus's Lies of the Ancients, though little regarded these days for its erroneous claims regarding the founding of Valyria and certain lineal claims in the Reach and Westerlands, does speculate that the others of legend were nothing more than a tribe of the first men, ancestors of the wildlings, that had established itself in the far north. Because of the Long Night, these early wildlings were then pressured to begin a wave of conquest to the south. That they became monstrous in the tales told thereafter, according to Formus, reflects the desire of the Night's Watch and the Starks to give themselves a more heroic identity as saviours of mankind, and not merely the beneficiaries of a struggle over dominion.
So, although it's implied we should question some of this information from the pen of a maester who's stated to be unreliable, there's almost always an element of truth behind these sidebars. That the first men were settling the fringes of the map before the Long Night is, as we've said, logical enough that we can probably believe that tidbit without issue. But the speculation about a tribe from up north fleeing south during the Long Night taps into one of the series' great mysteries. Who are the others?
Yeah, this is one instance where the reader knows more than the stuffy maesters. Given we witness a group of others on page in the opening prologue, where fledgling Night's Watch Ranger Sir Waymar Royce is defeated by a cold being with an icy blade, readers can be certain of their existence, and also reasonably certain that they are not, as implied by Fomas, simply a tribe of renegade men. And so, given our introduction to the series, when Archmaester Fomas describes the others as nothing more than a tribe of proto-freefolk attempting to flee south from the impossible cold the long night brought, most savvy readers understand that he's being intentionally dismissive about a phenomenon and a group of beings he doesn't fully understand.
In-world, Southerners, including the maesters of the Citadel and Old Town, tend to believe that the others are a fairy story or an exaggeration, essentially in agreement with Fomas. However, readers suspect that the others are in fact the cause of the long night, which is not simply some natural occurrence. It's made plain that the seasons are askew due to a magical imbalance that seems to be related to others and dragons. There's also extreme cold whenever the others are around, and so the possibility that they can bring darkness too doesn't seem unlikely.
So we can discard some of this sidebar. Yet, could there be real clues about the origins of the others hidden within the skepticism? Could there have really been a tribe up north that was somehow transformed into the others? Were the children of the forest part of the equation, given that the others are shown to possess human traits both in their humanoid appearance and in their behaviours, such as their laughter and apparent code of conduct displayed in the opening prologue? Would it be a stretch to imagine that they had human origins?
We covered the others in depth in our episode 76, so we won't wade too much further into this discussion, but we can certainly posit that while the others in the Long Night were not just a tribe of simple humans fleeing south, a tribe of humans could be pertinent to any origin story George reveals in the final 2 books. The sidebar exists for a reason, and it's down to the reader to try and unravel the truth and engage in the mystery.
So, others aside for a moment, it seems highly likely that in the run-up to the Long Night there were human tribes in the far north. Given that we know the children of the forest were driven into the far north, it seems likely that they resided in the area too. In Old Nan's tale about the Long Night, she mentions that here and there in the fastness of the woods, the children still lived in their wooden cities and hollow hills, and the faces in the trees kept watch.
Of course, there were children living around the neck in the crannigs at that time, but given the focus concerns the others, it seems more likely that Old Nan is referring to areas of woodland in the far north, such as the Haunted Forest. The last hero, quote, set out into the Deadlands with a sword, a horse, a dog, and a dozen companions. For years he searched until he despaired of ever finding the children of the forest in their secret cities.
In A Dance with Dragons, we're with young Bran Stark as he reaches the mysterious cave north of the wall, where his mentor-in-waiting, Bloodraven, watches the world through the Weirwood network. With a labyrinth of subterranean tunnels and piles of old bones wherever he looks, could this be one of the children's secret cities mentioned by Old Nan? Or even the secret city where the last hero finally met the children after his long search?
What seems certain is that there were children living in the far north, although their need for secret cities perhaps suggests that they weren't living side by side with the proto-freefolk. Still, their potential close proximity should be noted, especially when considering the possibility that the children aided the creation of the others.
And then there are the giants. Although it's clear the giants and children had an uncomfortable relationship through the Dawn Age, sometimes breaking into conflict, it doesn't appear the 2 species posed existential threats to each other as humans did. With the coming of the first men, giants were also driven from their homes and perhaps lacked the negotiating skills to establish a common understanding like the Pact, an agreement that they were notably left out of. So it seems logical that the giants, on the back foot just like the children, ended up in the far north too. In fact, an account of the Long Night in the World Book states, In the north, they tell of a last hero who sought out the intercession of the children of the forest, his companions abandoning him or dying one by one as they faced ravenous giants, cold servants, and the others themselves.
So, if the last hero was searching in the far north, and if we can put stock in the folktales, it seems there were both giants and children living close to northern tribes on the fringes of the habitable world, along with a group described as cold servants, which we readers can guess the identity of. Given the colorful artwork we see in the world book of giants and a child of the forest aiding Brandon the Builder's efforts to raise the wall, coupled with the fact that giants remained north of the wall in the modern story, all of this seems reasonable enough. And so we can begin to imagine what life was like in the far north before the long night changed Westeros forever.
With the north being so cold, living there has always been different compared to living in the south. In Westeros, there's a definite north-south divide, as there is in Britain, and it's clear that northern culture as a whole is distinct, a factor which was emphasized when the Andals arrived to take over the south, leaving the north to its own devices. Following the religion of the old gods, developing traditions and customs such as guest right, and shaped by the harsh and bleak winters, including the horror of the long night, northern culture became separated from the areas below the neck. George designed Westeros this way to give his world more complexity and depth, and sought to ingrain northern values in many of his main characters, such as Ned and Robb Stark, creating avenues for political and cultural conflict between North and South.
But within the north, there are also different factions. Given the far north required settlements to specialize in different survival skills, what we see of the free folk in the main story are tribes with different aptitudes. For example, the men of the frozen shore live in huts of ice, no doubt similar to real-world igloos, and transport themselves using walrus-bone chariots pulled by dogs, the fantasy version of dog sleds. In adapting to their hostile environment, this tribe has developed its own culture over the millennia. The reader can imagine the early days in the far north when settlers were splitting off into different tribes and gradually gaining unique identities and subcultures.
The result is, in this remote area of the map, cultural diversity. While those in the far north were all dealing with the same cold and barren land, different tribes developed in different ways, a fact that leaps off the page when Jon Snow gets to know the free folk in the modern timeline, highlighting the need for a skilled leader like Mance Rayder to bind the disparate factions together for a common cause.
And that cause is, of course, the threat of the others. We've noted that in the north, the memory of the long night runs deep to this day, perhaps as much as 8,000 years later. When Mance aims the united free folk tribe south, he's acting with the experience of their forefathers in his mind. These distant ancestors of the free folk, however, had no such experience to draw from, and so the original wave of others' attacks must have been as terrifying as it was devastating. Take this account from Old Nan to envisage what the conditions might have been like. Thousands and thousands of years ago, a winter fell that was cold and hard and endless beyond all memory of man. There came a night that lasted a generation, and kings shivered and died in their castles even as the swineherds in their hovels. Women smothered their children rather than see them starve, and cried and felt their tears freeze on their cheeks. In that darkness, the others came for the first time.
So with the others striking from the far north, those remote tribes on the fringes must have had it worse than anyone. The conditions up there are difficult to begin with, so an ongoing winter and supernatural cold must have devastated the local population. But at the same time, any tribe surviving those conditions would have been hardened in their resilience. Perhaps when the others passed through the far north into the lands to the south, conditions improved in their wake, and some tribes on the fringes lived to tell the tale.
And it's Old Nan again who provided snippets of information about the proto-free folk during the long night. Early in A Game of Thrones, Bran recalls what she told him about the so-called wildlings. He remembered the hearth tales old Nan told them. The wildlings were cruel men, she said, slavers and slayers and thieves. They consorted with giants and ghouls, stole girl children in the dead of night, and drank blood from polished horns. And their women lay with the others in the long night to sire terrible, half-human children.
There's always a degree of hyperbole in hearth tales, especially those told millennia after the fact, with the express goal of scaring young Bran Stark. Yet of all Old Nan's assertions, the one that the proto-free folk lay with the others to sire terrible half-human children certainly raises eyebrows. When we later hear the tale of the Night's King, we learn the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch coupled with a blue-eyed, pale-skinned, otherly woman who eventually became his corpse queen. Could there have been unions between women and male others? Is it possible the Night's Queen was one of these half-human children?
And the notion of others' blood mingling with human blood is an interesting one, perhaps not without precedent. With Maester Luwin telling Bran that, quote, the histories say the Crannogmen grew close to the children of the forest in the days when the Greenseers tried to bring the hammer of the waters down upon the neck, we're left to consider how loaded the phrase grew close to is. And in the World Book, we learn more about the children and the Crannogmen, with Maester Yandel stating, the swamp dwellers of the Neck are known as Crannogmen for the floating islands on which they raise their halls and hovels. They are a small, sly people. Some say they are small in stature because they intermarried with the children of the forest.
With overt hints that the children's magical warging, Green Dreamer and Green Seer blood found its way into humans, this theory provides a strong explanation as to how there came to be human characters able to display these magical green abilities. And we learn that in the main story that beyond the wall, the physical barrier that has kept the far northern First Men's bloodline pure, there seems to be a relatively high rate of skin changes, with characters like Borok, Hagan, Orell, and Varamir displaying their abilities.
So, given the coexistence of children and humans in the Crannogs and also in the far north, it seems likely the proto-freefolk populations boasted individuals with innate green magic. These skills might have been very useful for survival, such as warging a wolf to hunt deer. But the discussion about others' potential crossing with humans brings us back to the notion that the others themselves were a tribe of proto-freefolk, somehow corrupted. If this tribe had green-seeing abilities, it would go a long way towards explaining how the others are able to psionically control their legions of zombies. We might consider if this ability is a dark form of skin changing, and certainly we witness Bran Stark take over Hodor's mind, proving skin-changing humans is possible. The main difference with the others is that they are controlling dead humans.
The others wrought so much havoc in the north that they're remembered to this day, and so we can only imagine how the devastation affected those in the far north. Teetering on the brink of defeat, humanity finally found a way to overcome their icy foe and drive them back to the far, far north in the freezing expanse known as the Lands of Always Winter. The resistance seemed to have consisted of the last hero wielding an other-slaying dragon steel blade, the children of the forest perhaps providing crucial dragonglass-related know-how, and the original iteration of the Night's Watch.
Yeah, there's a lot more about this in our recent two-parter on the Night's Watch, so we'll just briefly summarize here. We learned that the Night's Watch were formed before the raising of the Wall in this passage from the Harvest Feast at Winterfell in A Clash of Kings. The music grew wilder, the drummers joined in, and Hother Umber brought forth a huge, curved war horn, banded in silver, when the singer reached the part in The Night That Ended, where the Night's Watch rode forth to meet the others in the battle for the dawn. He blew a blast that set all the dogs to barking.
Following a successful resistance in the Battle for the Dawn, which may or may not have occurred at the site on which Winterfell was later built, humanity finally found itself in a position to rebuild all the others had destroyed. As we said, there was no precedent for the long night back then, so there was always the chance that the others could return with vengeance on their mind at any given moment. Given the generational trauma the North had suffered, it wasn't long before designs were being drawn up to build a strategic barrier to keep the others out of Westeros for good.
And the man behind this scheme was apparently the founder of House Stark, Brandon the Builder. It's suggested in the World Book that he personally oversaw the initial construction of the wall, teaming up with giants and the Children of the Forest. The giants used their brute force and their mammoths to transport large blocks of ice into place, with the children perhaps imbuing the structure with magic. The result was a 300-mile-long structure stretching from east coast to west, which became the northern border of the Seven Kingdoms. Everything south was Westeros, everything north was Wildlands. The trouble was that Brandon didn't just divide the land, he divided the First Men themselves.
Thousands of years later, we might speculate why settlements of First Men were left north of the wall, essentially trapped in with the others. One possibility is that there were pockets of First Men who simply refused to move. We've discussed how different tribes must have adapted to their environment. With those tribes forming subcultures, perhaps it was difficult for them to face the prospect of resettlement, especially with their cold enemies being apparently vanquished. And let's not forget the fierce opposition to kingship and authority that pervades their culture in the current story. That tradition might have taken root as far back as the history books go.
Another possibility is that the tribes in the far north were stigmatized in the aftermath of the Long Night. Old Nan telling Bran that wildling women lay with the others during the Long Night could be a demonstration of an ancient feeling of ill will towards the far northerners by the Westerosi northerners. If the region had really become a diverse place, it's possible that some settlements were frowned upon, especially if there were rumors of alleged sympathies towards the others, or if it was commonly thought that the others had been a tribe of First Men living on the fringes. Such beliefs, true or not, might have created an us versus them dynamic in the north.
Yeah, let's not forget the real-world inspiration for the wall was Hadrian's Wall in Britain, designed to separate the so-called Wild Scots from the Roman settlements to the south. The perception was that everything to the north was the unconquerable wilderness full of wild people, and so perhaps Brandon the Builder thought in similar terms.
Whatever the truth behind some human settlements remaining north of the wall, and the possibilities we highlighted certainly aren't exhaustive or mutually exclusive, the hard facts are that the wall went up, was added to over time to make it difficult to scale, and was patrolled by the same organization who had aided the last hero in defeating the others during the Long Night, the Night's Watch. Apparently, anyone living to the north of the wall was not to be allowed to cross, which put the Proto-Free Folk and the Watch in opposition, a rivalry that grew fiercer over the centuries and millennia that followed.
And in cutting off the far northerners physically from the rest of the north, Brandon also cut them off culturally. Those north of the wall were not bound to the laws of the lands to the south, were not obliged to kneel to kings, and were free to develop their own culture as they saw fit. They were paradoxically both trapped and free. The Westerosi to the south came to refer to them disparagingly as wildlings, but to themselves they were now proud free folk.
It's clear the wall was erected and then guarded to keep the others out of Westeros, avoiding another horrific Long Night scenario where countless northerners were killed and then enslaved as an undead army. And in the years that followed, the horrors were still fresh in the minds of those south of the wall. But to those north of the wall, the threat of the others must have remained very real. If the others did decide to attack again, what chance would they have being hemmed in with them? It must have been obvious to the free folk that they themselves were now the prime candidates to become a new generation of the others' cold servants, and equally obvious that their former neighbors were happy to let that happen, as long as they stayed put in the far north.
And it's unclear what exactly happened to the others. Was it a full and immediate retreat out of sight after the War for the Dawn? Were they still present for a while as the wall was being built? And were there still remnants of their invasion after the icy barrier had been constructed? With information so scant it's difficult to say, but for the former point, there's the legend of the Night's King.
Yeah, and we've covered the Night's King many times, so we won't be retreading the story too much here. But it does seem to indicate that there were still vestiges of the others present in the region for years after the last hero's victory. In the story, it was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, whose name has been erased from history, who spied an otherly woman from atop the wall. As we've said, this brings to mind Old Nan's comments to Bran about wildling women laying with the others and siring half-human children.
Whether the Night's Queen was one of these offspring, or whether she was just a straight-up other, or something else entirely, remains a mystery. But it's worth noting that Craster gifts his sons to the cold gods north of the wall, hinting, perhaps, that all others are male. Whatever the case, the Queen was otherly, so imagine being trapped north of the wall, fearing being slaughtered by merciless foe, and then resurrected as an undead slave. And there's someone walking around with, quote, skin as white as the moon and eyes like blue stars. We wonder if she was alone, or if there were more like her, and how they would have been received by the locals.
Unwilling to resist the woman's beauty, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch brought her to the Night Fort, declaring they would be king and queen, and enthralling the men of the Watch with strange sorceries. Given that it's implied, in an eerie echo of Craster from the main series, that the pair then commenced sacrificing their own children to the others, there's the possibility that the queen was a sort of honey trap and that the goal was to replenish the others' ranks somehow. Whatever the case, they were clearly a threat not just to the Watch, but to everything south of the Wall.
For 13 years they had ruled, Night's King and his corpse queen, till finally the Stark of Winterfell and Joramun of the Wildlings had joined to free the Watch from bondage.
In the main story, we're used to the Night's Watch and Free Folk being in conflict. Those dynamics seem to have existed for millennia. Yet in these nascent days at the Wall, the tale of the Night's King serves to demonstrate that there was still cooperation possible between the two factions. The situation of the Night's King and his queen was resolved when, quote, the Stark of Winterfell and Joramun of the Wildlings joined to free the Watch from bondage.
This is a really interesting detail because, in addition to possible parallels with the cooperation between the Watch and the Free Folk in the main series, it seems like the Free Folk in the time of the Night's King could still be convinced to aid the Watch to defeat an enemy that was a danger to both sides. In our Night's Watch series, we examined how the Watch have historically maintained close ties with the Starks to guard the Wall, often against wildling incursions, and yet here we see the Free Folk joining with the Starks to defend the Watch.
In A Clash of Kings, we learned that Joramun was an important historical figure for the Free Folk, the first king beyond the Wall. It's Quarren Halfhand who educates Jon Snow about the historical threat from these kings beyond the Wall. He lists Mance Rayder, Raymond Redbeard, Bale the Bard, the Horned Lord, and the brothers Gendel and Gorn, and finally says, in ancient days, Joramun, who blew the horn of winter and woke giants from the earth. Quarren continues, each man of them broke his strength on the Wall, or was broken by the power of Winterfell on the far side.
It's easy to see the so-called wildlings as the enemy. In the beginning of the main story, we're in the minds of northerners, plied with tales from Old Nan, and made aware of the threat from the Free Folk raiding against the Watch. Raiding missions aside, we later learn that these people are frightened by the return of the others. So imagine what Joramun dealt with in the wake of the Long Night, with horrific memories still fresh in the collective consciousness. The Night's King tale gives a vague timeline. He was the 13th Lord Commander, and there were clearly still otherly remnants north of the Wall, so Joramun uniting the tribes happened a relatively short time after the War for the Dawn. We find it unlikely he was warring for the sake of warring.
In the main series, King Beyond the Wall Mance Rayder unites the free folk in an effort to escape the others, and so it seems fairly likely that Joramun had the same goal. If the others weren't entirely vanquished, as the existence of the Night's Queen suggests, but were merely banished into the farther north, then they may have continued to be a threat to human life. And while there may have been free folk in that ancient era who stubbornly refused to leave their lands and lifestyle behind, even in the face of that terrible threat, they were surely also those who were desperate to get their families south. Was Joramun a leader for this purpose, like Mance?
If Corin is to be believed, Joramun did attack the wall with a united host of free folk. In spite of his evident defeat, he demonstrated the power of the free folk, putting aside any internal conflict and coming together as one fist, an ethos which no doubt inspired Mance and numerous others in between to do the same. If the free folk remained in their individual tribes, occasionally raiding across the wall or attacking the watch, they would barely leave a dent. It was only when they came together that they posed a significant threat or created leverage, and if the watch didn't have Winterfell in their corner, then perhaps the free folk would have been more successful historically.
But getting back to the situation at the Night Fort, and Joramun apparently joining the Stark of Winterfell to free the Watch from the dominion of the Night's King, how do we resolve these two very different sounding stories? Well, one thought we had was that perhaps these two quotes actually describe the same thing. In other words, Joramun takes advantage of the temporary incapacity of the Night's Watch under the Night's King to try to force a passage through with the aid of giants, only to be convinced by the Stark of Winterfell that the others, in the persons of the Night's King and Night's Queen, were the greater threat.
The mention of Joramun blowing the horn of winter is another interesting tidbit that hints at a method the King Beyond the Wall had in mind for getting his host south. The Horn of Winter is an oft-mentioned artifact pertinent to the main story. Legend has it that the horn has the power to bring down the wall, and in the main timeline we learn Mance has been searching for it, turning over ancient graves in his desperation to find it. He hopes the threat of blowing the horn and therefore bringing down the wall will scare the Watch into letting his host come south. After Melisandre burns what she believes to be the horn along with Rattleshirt, Tormund confesses to Jon that Mance never found the true horn, but hoped that the ancient war horn that he claimed to be the one would be enough to scare the Watch into opening their gates to preserve the integrity of the wall.
The fact we're told that Joramun actually blew the Horn of Winter is quite intriguing. It's said the action awoke giants from the earth, and yet evidently the wall didn't come down. Perhaps this proves that it's not enough to simply blow the horn in any location, but one needs to be close to the wall for the desired effect to take place. Waking giants from the earth sounds like a pre-scientific way to describe an earthquake, perhaps, which could make sense in the context of bringing down the wall. Stand close to the wall, induce an earthquake, and a piece of the structure would cave in. It seems like a decent enough conjecture about how the horn would function.
The only reason we can think of as to why Joramun blew the horn and didn't succeed in bringing down the wall is that he wasn't close enough in proximity. Perhaps, like Mance, he didn't actually want to bring the wall down with respect to its value in keeping the others contained. Perhaps Joramun blew the horn away from the wall to display its power and convince the Watch to let his host south. Whatever the case, it doesn't sound like the Watch or Winterfell were ready to acquiesce.
And of course, if the Watch was at the time under the sway of the Night's King and his Queen, that might answer their inaction. From the point of view of the Night's King, it seems like the wall coming down would be a good thing. At the same time, it feels very in keeping with the generational antagonism between the free folk and their counterparts south of the wall for the Stark in Winterfell to perhaps make promises to Joramun to gain the free folk's cooperation, followed by some good old-fashioned Westerosi betrayal, which would resolve the disparity between the two stories about Joramun and provide even more reasons for free folk to hate Southerners.
But over the following centuries, it seems as though the others did not return to threaten the free folk, the wall, or their southern neighbours. While the trauma of the Long Night was never completely forgotten, the memories faded with each generation. The Night's Watch gradually forgot its true purpose, eventually coming to view the free folk as their main enemy, a dynamic that was fiercely reciprocated. The problem for the free folk was that for a long period of history, the Night's Watch was an honourable calling in Westeros, and their castles were well manned.
While Mance, and probably Joramun, had the understandable motive for uniting the free folk of protecting their people from the others, for the other historical kings beyond the wall, that might not have been the case. Recalling Quarren Halfhand's list of these kings beyond the wall that we mentioned earlier, let's start out with Gendel and Gorn.
Yeah, these brother kings ruled jointly and struck south of the wall via the complex series of underground caves that Jon Snow and Ygritte explore in A Storm of Swords. It's in that scene that we get the story of Gendel and Gorn, apparently from 3,000 years before the main story. As Ygritte tells it, the brothers navigated the caves to get to the other side of the wall, bringing their host with them. In doing so, they escaped the gaze of the Night's Watch, but were confronted by a Stark host. During the subsequent battle, Gorn slew the King in the North, only to be slain himself by the King in the North's son.
By that point, the battle was raging, and the sound of the sword fighting reached the ears of the Watch, who proceeded to surprise the free folk from the rear. Jon Snow proves that the story is still told south of the wall too, when he says, Gendel had the king to the south, the Umbers to the east, and the Watch to the north of him. He died as well.
Ygritte takes exception to that last part, explaining that Gendel retreated with the remnants of his host through the caves. However, the caves came to be known as Gorn's Way for a reason. Gendel didn't know them as well as his dead brother did. The free folk found themselves lost in the dark and never saw the light again. The coda to the story, according to Ygritte, is that the descendants of this long-lost host still live in the caves to this day and have developed a taste for human flesh. This brings to mind the legend of Sawney Bean from Scotland, where a cannibalistic family lived in a cave, preying on lost passers-by.
Overall, the story of Gendel and Gorn highlights both the similarities and differences between free folk and northern folklore. They tell the same stories, although the details differ according to which side of the wall you're on, which is a great metaphor for the division the wall created. Both sides were first men, culturally separated for millennia, until they appeared to be entirely separate people.
The next king beyond the wall on the timeline is the Horned Lord. In the World Book, we get this from Maester Yandel. The Horned Lord would follow Gendel and Gorn 1,000 years after, or perhaps 2. His name is lost to history, but he was said to have used sorcery to pass the wall.
While we know little more about the Horned Lord or what became of him, he did leave a lasting impression on the free folk. 1,000 or more years after his death, he's still being cited. In A Storm of Swords, Mance Rayder's wife Dalla tells Jon Snow, "The Horned Lord once said sorcery is like a sword without a hilt. There's no safe way to grasp it." If the Horned Lord did indeed use sorcery in his attempt to pass the wall, Dalla's comment strongly implies that it didn't end well for him.
Then there was Bael the Bard, famous on both sides of the wall. He was a free folk raider who caused problems for Winterfell, and in the heat of angry rhetoric, Brandon Stark called him a coward. To prove he was no coward, Bael scaled the wall, infiltrated Winterfell in disguise, and presented himself as a musician. So impressed was Brandon Stark with his musical talent that he offered Bael a reward, and Bael asked for the fairest flower that blooms in the gardens of Winterfell as his prize, which the Stark duly presented to him. But that very night, Bael disappeared with Brandon's only daughter, leaving the blue rose he had been given symbolically upon her pillow.
Enraged and fearing his line might go extinct since the daughter was his only child, Brandon ordered the Watch to search for Bael. However, it would turn out that Bael had been hiding in the Winterfell crypts all along. When the Stark daughter finally resurfaced a year later, she had a son with her, who one day became the Lord of Winterfell. 30 years later, when Bael, as King Beyond the Wall, headed south with his host, he would be slain by his own son, now the Lord of Winterfell. When Brandon's daughter, now mother to the current lord, saw Bael's severed head displayed as a trophy, she threw herself from a tower to her death.
Whereas the legend of the Horned Lord was scant on details, this tale has deeper significance. The blue rose symbolism forms part of the evidence for the RLJ theory. The fact that Bael hid in the crypts feeds into the mystery of where Bran disappeared to after Theon Greyjoy took Winterfell. And the fact that Bael fathered a son who would become the Lord of Winterfell highlights that the Free Folk are part of the Stark heritage. And don't forget, when Mance Rayder enters Winterfell in disguise in A Dance with Dragons, he calls himself Abel, an anagram of Bael. There are many layers to this legend, exemplifying how George uses lore and history to support and inform the current story. And by the way, we do have a 3-part series on the myths and legends of A Song of Ice and Fire if you want a deeper dive. That's episodes 34, 36 and 38.
During the reign of the Targaryens, there was another king beyond the wall, although we know almost nothing about him, including his name. In Fire and Blood, we learn that during Jaehaerys and Alysanne's reign, Princess Sarah desired a partner. Archmaester Gildane states, "The king and queen must have been relieved to see how eagerly Sarah took to the young men of the court, and they to her. At 14, she told the king she meant to marry the Prince of Dorne, or perhaps the king beyond the wall, so she could be a queen like mother."
While the thought of a royal Targaryen marrying a king of the Free Folk sounds intriguing and brings about many interesting questions, such as whether the Targaryens actually acknowledged a king beyond the wall, in reality this snippet serves to demonstrate how overeager the rebellious Sarah was for marriage and status, rather than being a realistic notion that King Jaehaerys would have entertained. Gildane goes on to call it an idle fantasy.
Finally, around 75 years before the beginning of the main series, Raymond Redbeard breached the wall with a host of free folk. He'd started gathering his host in circa 212 AC, and some 14 years later, he was ready to attack. We covered this in detail in our Night's Watch episode, but to recap, Raymond carved out a toehold on the wall, then sent rope ladders down to get their men over. The raiders evaded the attention of the Watch, whose Lord Commander, Jolly Jack Musgood, became forever after known as Sleepy Jack for his failure.
As for the fate of Redbeard's attack, we learn in A Dance with Dragons that Raymond's host had met a bloody end on the shores of Long Lake, caught between Lord Willem of Winterfell and the drunken giant Harmond Umber. Redbeard had been slain by Artos the Implacable, Lord Willem's younger brother. The Watch arrived too late to fight the wildlings, but in time to bury them, the task that Artos Stark assigned them in his wrath, as he grieved above the headless corpse of his fallen brother.
One of the purposes of this tale is to emphasize how much the Watch have declined in recent generations, from up to 17 castles, each manned by thousands of men in their heyday, to only 3 manned castles and fewer than 1,000 men in total in the current story. Following the disaster of the Great Ranging, the Watch's power is further diminished, and when Jon Snow eventually becomes Lord Commander, he has to prove his leadership of the vulnerable organization in order to avoid becoming another Sleepy Jack.
Overall, while we have this list of kings beyond the wall over the years, we don't learn much of their motives. As we said, it seems a good bet that only Joramun and Mance were attempting to flee from the others, and so for the rest we can only speculate. Perhaps it was as simple as the age-old pillage, plunder and captive-taking that motivates so many early territorial wars. Given there are no castles beyond the wall, we wonder if the idea of taking Winterfell was the ultimate goal for some of these men.
And that's our look at the history of the free folk, from the ancient days as first men living in an undivided north to the succession of kings beyond the wall who struck south over the millennia that followed the long night. Up next, we're going to take a close look at what isolation beyond the wall did for free folk culture as we consider their way of life. And now it's time for us to say thank you to our patrons from the Valyrian Steel level. Thanks so much to Aileen, Oxheart, Blithe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabbath the Unfrozen, Dean, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Dolorous Fred, Jill, JM, Herbert Westeros, the Miskatonic Maester, Lady Silverwing, Mark, Boss, Schwartz the Black, the Sithorian, Sally, Tristis Lorien, Wild Child of the Wolfswood, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron. The wildlings were cruel men, slayers and slavers and thieves. They consorted with giants and ghouls, stole girl children in the dead of night, and drank blood from polished horns, and their women lay with the others in the long night to sire terrible, half-human children.
While planning A Song of Ice and Fire, George R.R. Martin decided to present the story via numerous POVs in order to explore the inner lives of individuals and represent different factions. We have multiple POVs for Starks, Lannisters and Greyjoys to emphasize their importance to the story, yet not all of the important factions get a point of view. While we begin the saga with Will, a man of the watch, there's no such treatment for the free folk until Varamir's single-chapter prologue in A Dance with Dragons. Instead, we learn about them from the Watchmen and Northerners who have feared and despised them for so many generations that their prejudicial views have become deeply embedded in their culture.
And so the reader gets a slanted perspective on the wildlings from the outset. The quote from Old Nan we mentioned earlier and began with here, that the wildlings were slavers and slayers and thieves who consorted with giants and ghouls, demonstrates the typical northern attitude of fear and disdain for those north of the wall. Early in the novels, the reader's left guessing on how much of this information is true and how much is exaggeration. One thing seems certain: the author was trying to create a bias against the free folk from the beginning, a commentary on how one culture can allow alarmism to color their views of another culture.
And so by creating an anti-wildling bias amongst characters and readers alike, George is setting us up for Jon Snow's mindset as he infiltrates the free folk camp and begins to understand the reality of the Watcher's sworn enemies firsthand. Jon soon crosses the line from viewing those north of the wall as wildlings to using their own terminology, the free folk.
And so the question then arises, how much of the free folk's reputation fed to us by the likes of Old Nan is true? It's time to look at what we learn about their culture from the point of view of Jon Snow, whom we've noted many times to be an excellent observer of people. When Tormund tells him in A Storm of Swords that a man's member grows to be imperceptibly small if it's not used, it says, Jon had no answer for that. Small wonder that the Seven Kingdoms thought the free folk scarcely human. They have no laws, no honor, not even simple decency. They steal endlessly from each other, breed like beasts, prefer rape to marriage, and fill the world with base-born children.
Of course, in this judgment, Jon doesn't immediately realize that filling the world with children born out of wedlock isn't culturally significant north of the wall, meaning that there, one of the main problems in his life would not exist. If there was no such thing as trueborn or baseborn in Westeros, he himself wouldn't bear the shame and disadvantage of being labelled a bastard. Is it any wonder that Jon ends up quite comfortable with the free folk in a society that doesn't give two figs about his birth status?
And the character Jon grows most comfortable with is Ygritte, the spearwife with kissed by fire, lucky red hair. While Tormund endears the free folk to Jon with his warmth and belly laughs, through Ygritte, George offers us a valuable exposition about the free folk's ethos and way of life. The verbal sparring between a free folk woman and a man of the watch gives us a both sides perspective of life beyond the wall. Take this exchange about the free folk's notorious raiding parties when they're near Queen's Crown.
This land belongs to the Watch.
No one lives here.
Your raiders drove them off.
They were cowards then. If they wanted the land, they should have stayed and fought.
Maybe they were tired of fighting, tired of barring their doors every night and wondering if Rattleshirt or someone like him would break them down and carry off their wives, tired of having their harvest stolen and any valuables they might have. It's easier to move beyond the reach of raiders.
You know nothing, Jon Snow. Daughters are taken, not wives. You're the ones who steal. You took the whole world and built the wall to keep the free folk out.
Did we? How did that happen?
The gods made the earth for all men to share. Only when the kings come with their crowns and steel swords, they claimed it was all theirs. My trees, they said, you can't eat them apples. My stream, you can't fish here. My wood, you're not to hunt. My earth, my water, my castle, my daughter. Keep your hands away or I'll chop them off. But maybe if you kneel to me, I'll let you have a sniff. You call us thieves, but at least a thief has to be brave and clever and quick. A kneeler only has to kneel.
So we can see that among the many points of conflict between Jon and Ygritte's worldview is the basic factor of freedom. They don't call themselves the free folk for no reason. They take great pride in the fact that they don't kneel to any authority. Even in times of there being a king beyond the wall, who may simply be a war leader chosen by a majority, nobody is expected to act so deferentially.
The passage also hints that this could have been one of the factors as to why the free folk were divided from the rest of Westeros, as we covered in the first segment. With their independent spirit and fervent pushback against kingship, the far northerners might have been deemed ungovernable. Over time, this difference in societal ethos would only have heightened as the culture split. Since the free folk declined to be governed by royalty, at least in the traditional sense of kings and queens, it's easy to understand why they find pride in their independent spirit. Yet in George's world, a land without a defined legal system lends itself to a brutal way of life.
At its heart, this passage is a rebuttal of old Nan's words that we opened the section with. Nan calls the wildlings slavers, slayers and thieves. Ygritte calls them brave raiders, taking something that was meant to be theirs in the first place. It's Ygritte who proclaims that the wall was built to keep the free folk out and demolishes southern ideals of kingship as inherently unfair and cowardly. As for stealing girl children, Nan and Ygritte are in agreement here, though from Ygritte's perspective this is simply a facet of free folk culture. Wives are stolen from other tribes, a practice that evolved in order to keep bloodlines in the relatively small groups from being stale and overbred. As Ygritte explains, a true man steals a woman from afar to strengthen the clan. Women who bed brothers or fathers or clankin offend the gods and are cursed with weak and sickly children, even monsters.
And so it's not considered kidnap nor offensive, and many women of the free folk have a lot of agency over deciding who they get stolen by. In fact, Ygritte doesn't blink as she moves between talking about freedom north of the wall and stealing daughters south of the wall. This is one tradition Jon finds to be indefensible, although Ygritte does her best to explain, saying about any man who potentially tried to steal her, he'd have to be quick and cunning and brave to steal me, so his sons would be strong and smart as well. Why would I hate such a man as that?
Of course, by then, Jon had accidentally stolen Ygritte when he ambushed her in the Skirling Pass. In a passage in Jon 3 of A Storm of Swords, Jon contemplates the skies in the heavens, reflecting on the names he had learned from Maester Luwin versus the names used north of the wall. We look up at the same stars and see such different things. Ygritte tells him that the star known as the Red Wanderer in the south is called the Thief beyond the wall, that it had been passing through a constellation known as the Moon Maid among maesters on that night in Skirling. Such a conjunction was, she said, a propitious time for a man to steal a woman, concluding, like the night you stole me, the thief was bright that night.
So, the free folk equivalent to marriage involves a man raiding another clan, forcibly removing a woman while she attempts to fight him off, then carrying her off home. While Southern marriage traditions carry their own ick factor, such as child matches and even incest, both of which are viewed with disgust by free folk, it's such a significant divergence that it's probably no wonder that this is one of the issues Jon can't align himself with, even when his loyalty to the Watch is being tested.
And another tradition brought up in that long passage we read is the issue of raiding parties. If the free folk enjoy their culture and situation, then why do they feel the need to continually test the Watcher's resolve and steal from the south? The wall is 700 feet tall. It's dangerous to climb, yet they keep coming.
In Fire and Blood, Archmaester Gildane reveals that during Good Queen Alisanne's trip to the Wall, she saw her first free folk at Castle Black. The captives were in cages ready to have their ears cut off to serve as a warning to other would-be raiders north of the Wall. Those that already had no ears, meaning they'd been caught raiding on 2 separate occasions, were to be beheaded.
Again, we see the inherent risk and dangers involved in raiding. So the million-dollar question is, why they keep coming, and there could be numerous answers here. First, we should remember that the raising of the wall left the free folk with limited lands in terms of resources. While Jon pours scorn on the notion that the raids are purely for self-preservation, he does highlight the fact that they do steal items they might not be able to get otherwise. Harmer and the Bag of Bones don't come raiding for fish and apples. They steal swords and axes, spices, silks and furs. They grab every coin and ring and jeweled cup they can find, casks of wine in summer and casks of beef in winter.
So, not only luxury goods and foodstuffs and treasure are being stolen, but metal goods such as swords and axes. It's worth noting that we never hear of a smith beyond the Wall, and that even the one tribe noted to use metal armor, the Thenns, are using bronze, a technology that involves casting rather than hammering, and that was left behind by the first men of Westeros sometime prior to the Long Night and later Andal invasion. But we also have to wonder if the raids are rooted more deeply than the acquisition of goods and technology, even those needed for survival. Ygritte's sentiment that the Westerosi are the real thieves for taking the lands for themselves to begin with reminds us that the enmity between the two sides has endured for millennia. Over time, the threat of the others has diminished, leaving the Free Folk and the Watchmen as staunch rivals. In our Night's Watch episode, we explored how the Men in Black came to see the Free Folk as the true enemy, and that dynamic goes 2 ways. Could part of the reason the Free Folk keep raiding be because they simply relish the rivalry? Has it become a sort of sport for them?
Of course, in the main books, with the threat of the others looming once again, there are clear and understandable motives for Mance sending raiders south of the Wall, which we'll discuss shortly in our upcoming Battle at the Wall episode. But before the White Walkers came into the frame again, perhaps the Free Folk and the Watch were simply trapped in an everlasting cycle of aggression towards each other. You're my enemy, and it's my inherent purpose to defeat you.
Yeah, with bloody rivalries passed on from generation to generation, it's difficult to say where those old enmities began or where they'll end. On the subject of generational rivalry, Tyrion Lannister thinks, in A Storm of Swords, it all goes back and back to our mothers and fathers and theirs before them. We are puppets dancing on the strings of those who came before us, and one day our own children will take up our strings and dance on in our steads.
So we must wonder if the policy of cutting ears off raiders actually worked as a deterrent, or if it was seen as evidence of the Night's Watch's brutality and simply radicalized the Free Folk against them even further. It would in fact be unsurprising to learn that the Free Folk viewed the lack of an ear as a status symbol. And we shouldn't forget the examples of men who had lost ears to frostbite. Such men, captured by the Watch in Jaehaerys' day, would have been marked for death immediately with no recourse, perhaps further feeding into the cycle of resentment and anger.
The Night's Watch, of course, had their own grievances with the free folk, and with casualties constantly suffered on either side, over the years this feud grew ever deeper. As we said, there were surely some amongst the free folk who raided as a challenge and tradition, perhaps even as a coming-of-age ritual, rather than as a means to an end.
And so raiding and woman stealing are the two aspects of free folk culture Jon objects to the most, yet over time he comes to see the beauty of the wild and enjoy the freedom their way of life offers, personified in Ygritte and standing in stark contrast with the strict institutional lifestyle at Castle Black that he'd committed himself to. Going undercover really opens his eyes, and as he begins to understand free folk culture, so does the reader.
Having addressed the more aggressive parts of their culture, let's now focus on other aspects that make the free folk unique. One interesting factor to note is that the free folk are both like and distinct from the Northerners. This allows Jon to relate to them, but at the same time, they stand out as different. Of course, any similarities one can find between the populations on either side of the wall are rooted in the fact that both cultures are First Men-based.
Yeah, with the south of Westeros being very Andal-centric, the north is somewhat removed from the main culture. There are certainly parallels between the wall cutting off the free folk from the north and the neck cutting the north off from the south, although the wall is obviously a more severe dividing line. And because of their shared First Men blood and heritage, there's plenty of cultural overlap between the free folk and northerners.
Take religion, for example. North of the wall, the main religion is that of the old gods, although it's not the only religion, as we'll discuss later. This gives their culture an immediate similarity to the North, with Jon thinking in A Dance with Dragons about the men of the northern hill tribes. Some had long beards, some had scars, some had both. All worshipped the old gods of the north, those same gods worshipped by the free folk beyond the wall.
So if the northerners have major things in common with the free folk, how do they become so separate? Well, the wall has been such a successful divider, it essentially kept the free folk trapped in a sort of time capsule. Cut off from Westeros, with limited resources, they failed to develop as the North did. Although the coming of the Andals has influenced the North over the years, for example bringing books and writing and advancement in metalworking technologies, such influence has barely affected the free folk. One might argue that their isolation has kept their First Men blood pure, evidenced by the apparently high rate of wargs, which we'll cover shortly.
As we mentioned, their resources were scarce and they didn't seem to have skilled metalworkers, factors which essentially kept them in the Bronze Age. Take this observation from Jon Snow in A Dance with Dragons. The arms most wildlings carry are little more than sticks. Wooden clubs, stone axes, mauls, spears with fire-hardened points, knives of bone and stone and dragonglass, wicker shields, bone armor, boiled leather. The Thenns worked bronze, and raiders like the Weeper carried stolen steel and iron swords looted off some corpse, but even those were oft of ancient vintage, dinted from years of hard use and spotted with rust.
So while there's evidence of mining from the Thenns, who are repeatedly depicted wearing bronze armor and carrying bronze blades, there's no evidence of ironworking, and the iron swords mentioned seem to have been taken or traded from the south. Given that there was iron around during the Long Night, according to Old Nan's tale, and that the Andals brought steel to Westeros possibly 6,000 years before the main story, we can see just how antiquated and stagnant the free folk culture has remained for many millennia. Even up north in Winterfell, they've owned Valyrian steel for many generations, by comparison.
Then there's language, another cultural cornerstone. While many of the free folk speak the common tongue, Jon learns in A Storm of Swords that the men of Thenn spoke the old tongue, and most had only a few words of the common. And in the World Book, Maester Yendel tells us that The original language of the first men, known as the Old Tongue, has come to be spoken only by wildlings beyond the wall.
The fact that the Old Tongue has remained the primary dialect for some factions north of the Wall tells us how impenetrable those cultures are, adding to the sense that Jon's mission to infiltrate them serves as a glimpse into the distant past. And Jon's observation during the Battle of Castle Black as he listened to the Free Folk's communication that strange voices called out in stranger tongues suggests that there are other yet more obscure languages amongst the different clans. We're told Mance Rayder speaks the Old Tongue, which no doubt served him well in his quest to unite the tribes, yet if there were other less spoken dialects involved, it demonstrates just how difficult it must have been to bring the whole host together.
And traditional and cultural differences with the North don't end there. In A Storm of Swords, Samwell Tarly learns of the tradition of milk names. North of the Wall, a newborn child receives only a temporary name. Sam thinks that was the wildling way. Not even Mance Rayder's son would get a name till his 3rd year. As such, Val nicknames Gilly's child Monster due to her perception of him as, quote, a sweet little monster. The Free Folk consider assigning a child's permanent name at birth bad luck, hence the milk names. The tradition is rooted in the tragic fact that infant mortality is extremely high beyond the Wall, where food is scarce, medical expertise is lacking, and the environment is harsh and cold. The milk name tradition is another marker of the divide between the North and the far North, and a rather sad one at that.
The Free Folk also have a love for music and sing songs that might not be known to the South. We learn from Tormund that there's a song about Raymond Redbeard's younger brother, known as the Red Raven, who fled the battle at Long Lake against the Watch and the Northerners. Tormund says to Jon, "Ever wonder why they call him the Red Raven?" Tormund's mouth split in a gap-toothed grin. "First to fly the battle he was. 'Twas a song about it after. The singer had to find a rhyme for Craven, so..."
Then there's The Last of the Giants, a song sung by the Free Folk that highlights the tragic diminishment of the ostensibly belligerent species they've formed close bonds with. North of the Wall, while on the move, Jon witnesses a rendition of the song, and the scene really brings home the importance of music to the community. It goes like this. "Do you know The Last of the Giants?" Without waiting for an answer, Ygritte sang, "Oh, I am the last of the giants. My people are gone from the earth." Tormund Giantsbane heard the words and grinned. "The last of the great mountain giants, who ruled all the world at my birth," he bellowed back through the snow. Longspear Rick joined in, singing, "Oh, the small folk have stolen my forests, they've stolen my rivers and hills. And they've built a great wall through my valleys, and fished all the fish from my rills," Ygritte and Tormund sang back at him in turn, in suitably gigantic voices. Tormund's sons Torrig and Dormund added their deep voices as well, then his daughter Munda and all the rest. Others began to bang their spears on leathern shields to keep rough time until the whole warband was singing as they rode.
This scene exemplifies the power of music to the Free Folk. It's a communal moment, bringing together the whole group while delivering the song's sad message at the same time. Given the bleakness of life beyond the Wall, the folk music tradition clearly gives the Free Folk a creative outlet that lifts spirits and encourages a sense of togetherness.
And we see further evidence of the power of music among the Free Folk when we learn about Bale the Bard and see his similarities with Mance Rayder. Is the fact that both men were adept musicians that eventually became kings beyond the Wall a coincidence? Well, in Mance's case, there's convincing evidence that his music aided his politics.
Mance is a harpist and lute player who can sing songs in the Common Tongue and the Old Tongue. Jon learns that Mance had spent years assembling this vast plodding host, talking to this clan mother and that Magnar, winning one village with sweet words, and another with a song, and a third with the edge of his sword.
Notice that in that sentence, Mance winning over villages with a song is given equal weight to him winning them over with his sword. He utilized his musicianship to endear himself to the free folk in his rise to becoming their king, which was no mean feat given his past as a man of the watch. There's a romance to the free folks' notion of music, and Mance has managed to convert his talent into political power, giving a deeper meaning to Jon's observation that Mance Rayder spoke the old tongue, even sang in it, fingering his lute and filling the night with strange, wild music. And now, on the subject of collecting the clans together, why don't we take a closer look at said clans?
The countless tribes and clans of the free folk remain worshippers of the old gods of the first men and children of the forest, the gods of the weirdwood trees. Some accounts say that there are those who worship different gods, dark gods beneath the ground in the Phosphang's, gods of snow and ice on the frozen shore, or crab gods at Storrel's Point, but such has never been reliably confirmed. The wildling raiders trouble the realm largely for iron and steel, things they lack the skill to make themselves. Many raiders are armed with weapons of wood and stone, even of horn in some cases. Some carry bronze axes and knives, but even these are considered valuable. The famous war leaders amongst them often sport stolen steel, sometimes taken from rangers of the Watch whom they have killed. Rangers of the Night's Watch speak of still stranger peoples who dwell in the more distant corners of the lands beyond the wall, of bronze-clad warriors from a hidden vale far to the north, and hornfoots who go barefoot even over ice and snow. We know of the wild people of the frozen shore who live in huts of ice and ride sleds pulled by hounds. There are half a dozen tribes who make their homes in caverns, and rumors tell of cannibals in the upper reaches of the icy rivers beyond the wall. But few rangers have penetrated more than 100 leagues into the haunted forest, and doubtless there are more kinds of wildlings than even they can imagine.
Going back to what we said early in the episode about groups of first men settling in the far north in ancient times and adapting to their specific surroundings, the united host Mance brings together is a diverse one. George might not have named every clan on page, but there are snippets of information about several very intriguing clans.
Let's start with the Thenns, who are given exposition when Jon heads over the wall with a small group including Ygritte, Val's lover Jarl, and Styr, the Thenn leader. He thinks, if all the wildlings were like Styr, it would be easier to betray them. The Thenns were not like the other free folk, though. The Magnar claimed to be the last of the first men and ruled with an iron hand. His little land of Thenn was a high mountain valley hidden amongst the northernmost peaks of the Frostfangs, surrounded by cave dwellers, Hornfoot men, giants, and the cannibal clans of the Ice Rivers. Ygritte said the Thenns were savage fighters and that their Magnar was a god to them. Jon could believe that. Unlike Jarl and Harmer and Rattleshirt, Styr commanded absolute obedience from his men, and that discipline was no doubt part of why Mance had chosen him to go over the wall.
There's lots of interesting information laid out in that quote. We've already mentioned that the Thenns mine metals and use a lot of bronze on their arms and armaments. And here there's the suggestion that they are the last of the first men. When we talk about the free folk being a time capsule of a bygone era, perhaps the Thenns are the best living example of what those ancient first men tribes were like before the raising of the wall, decorated in bronze, speaking the old tongue, and fighting savagely.
It's also interesting to consider the role of the Magnar in Thenn culture. Magnar means lord in the common tongue, and the fact the tribe looks up to their Magnar like a god shows the power of their leader. In fact, it's almost surprising that Mance was able to integrate the Thenns into his hosts, speaking to both the fear generated by the others and Mance's powers of persuasion.
With their laws and lords, it's clear the Thenns are somewhat removed from other groups north of the Wall, leading to Jon's comment to Iron Emmett about trying to influence the new Magnar, Sigorn, in A Dance with Dragons. Do not confuse the Thenns with free folk.
And coming from the northern extremities, in a hidden vale according to Maester Yandel, the Thenns are surrounded by other lesser mentioned, yet equally intriguing clans. There's the cave dwellers, who presumably live in caves, as some of our real-world ancestors did during the Stone Age. We learn from Jon's thoughts that the cave dwellers dye their faces blue and purple and green and file their teeth sharp. And from the World Book that there are free folk who worship dark gods beneath the ground, who are surely the cave dwellers. And wouldn't we love to know more about those underground gods?
And then there are the Hornfoot men, whose uniqueness comes from the fact that they wear no shoes, despite coming from around the Frostfangs where it's brutally cold. Here's Jon reflecting on the first time he saw members of the clan. With his own eyes, Jon had beheld the Hornfoot men trotting along in columns on bare soles as hard as boiled leather.
Before Mance established peace between the clans, the Hornfoot men were in conflict with the Night Runners. Information about the Night Runners is thin, but maybe their name hints at the notion that they are a nocturnal clan who like to roam after the sun has set.
Then there are the Ice River clans, living around the rivers close to the lands of Always Winter, which we can imagine are some of the most inhospitable places on the map. These clans are said to be cannibalistic, although whether that's fact or myth remains to be seen, bringing to mind the rumors in universe about the Skagosi, as well as certain tribes in our own world who are said to practice ritual cannibalism for reasons that ranged from the spiritual to the pragmatic.
The Ice River clan's bitter rivals are the men of the frozen shore. These are fisherfolk who live west of the Frostfangs. When Maester Yandel asserts that some free folk clans worship snow and ice, he might be referring to these frozen shore clans who live in snow huts, bringing igloos to mind. Jon thinks of them as walrus men, perhaps owing to the fact that they ride sleigh chariots comprised of walrus bones, as we see in this passage from A Dance with Dragons when Jon is presiding over the free folks passing through the wall, watching the procession of all the weird and wonderful factions. After the riders came the men of the frozen shore. Jon watched a dozen of their big bone chariots roll past him one by one, clattering like rattleshirt. Half still rolled as before, others had replaced their wheels with runners. They slid across the snowdrift smoothly, where the wheeled chariots were foundering and sinking. The dogs that drew the chariots were fearsome beasts, as big as direwolves. Their women were clad in sealskins, some with infants at their breasts. Older children shuffled along behind their mothers and looked up at Jon with eyes as dark and hard as the stones they clutched. Some of the men wore antlers on their hats, and some wore walrus tusks. The two sorts did not love each other, he soon gathered. A few thin reindeer brought up the rear, with the great dogs snapping at the heels of stragglers. "Be wary of that lot, Jon Snow," Tormund warned him. "As savage folk. The men are bad, the women worse."
So, many interesting details, not least the point that there are sub-clans who aren't fond of each other. Given the detail that the men of the frozen shore were also in conflict with the Ice River clans before Mance brought everyone together, we might ask why there are so many rivalries in the far north. Perhaps the fact that life is tough up there with scant resources available means there's an inherent tension as all parties fight for basic survival. Caught you fishing in my lake here, caught you slaughtering my walrus over there, might explain a few things.
But the clans beyond the wall are not the only clans in the north. So let's compare the free folk with the hill-mountain tribes such as the Flints, Wolves and Norries, who come into the story as Stannis seeks allies in A Dance with Dragons.
While clans on either side of the wall are descendants from the original wave of first men, worshippers of the old gods and weather-hardened and fearless, there's a huge difference. with those living south of the wall. The hill clans we hear of seem to reside in permanent structures, with George saying in a 2001 fan interaction that they do have lands and holdfasts, so at least they would have houses. Some may have fastnesses big enough to be called castles, even though they'd be small and rude by comparison to the great castles of the south. George also found a comparison to Scottish Highlander clans to be appropriate.
Perhaps the most pertinent difference between the clans on either side of the wall, though, is that the hill clans adhere to Stark rule. This might be why no one in story refers to them as wildlings, and from most accounts the clans seem highly respectful of their Lord Paramount, Eddard Stark, and are treated with respect in turn. Under the Starks, the clans are expected to uphold the common laws of the land.
Furthermore, the hill clans have no love for the free folk. Due to their proximity to the wall, they are often the target of free folk raiding, in which they've no doubt suffered casualties and lost daughters, aligning them with the Night's Watch. In A Dance with Dragons, Jon advises Stannis that "Your Grace must pass through the Norre's lands. They live the nearest to the gift, and have always been good friends to the Watch."
So while there might be points of comparison in their history and lifestyle, overall the northern clans are very different from the free folk, given that they are accepted and even respected members of the northern community. If we want to consider a truly parallel group in universe, we're better off looking at the mountain clans of the Vale.
The Vale clan, such as the Black Ears, Stone Crows, and Burned Men, also have First Men roots. Somewhat like the Free Folk, the Vale clans were split from the pack in early history. When the Andals finally took the Vale from the First Men after much bloodthirsty conflict, some of the First Men acquiesced and eventually integrated with their new rulers. However, there were some First Men too proud to assimilate, who fled to the Mountains of the Moon to forge a new, independent way of life. Though there was no physical wall to separate the clans, like in the north, the separation was real, and over time these clans became known as wildlings to mainstream Vale society.
Adhering to no lord, kneeling to no leaders other than their own, and living lawlessly, the Vale clans have an awful lot in common with the free folk. Like the raiders of the north, the Vale clans ambush travellers on roads to steal and pillage what they can. While Jon gets to know the free folk beyond the wall, it's Tyrion Lannister who forges a relationship with the Vale clans in the south, utilising their ruthlessness and ferocity. In his time in the capital acting as Hand, it says, "He had more faith in their iron loyalties and sense of honour than in the greed of sellswords. All King's Landing knew the wildlings were his."
So, there are many solid parallels between the free folk and mountain tribes, and others more speculative. We get an Arryn lineage lesson from Littlefinger in a Sansa Stark chapter in A Feast for Crows, and it turns out that in the recent past, the Burned Men carried off the last daughter of Alice Arryn and Sir Ellis Waynwood. Could this snippet indicate that the mountain clans practice the same woman-stealing tradition that the free folk do?
Whatever the case, it seems certain that the Free Folk and Vale clans have more in common with each other than the Northern clans. This highlights how living under laws as part of a greater society influences a culture and its people. With their isolation, limited resources, and harsh environment, the clans in the Mountains of the Moon remain another time capsule faction like the Free Folk.
And clans aside, there is another group found in the ranks of Mance's force that are from an entirely different species, the Giants. We have a patron-exclusive episode that goes into great depth on giants, but pertinent to today's discussion, here's a quote from the first time Jon Snow saw the Giants close up in Mance's host by the Milkwater.
The giants swayed slowly atop the mammoths as they rode past 2 by 2. Jon's Garen shied, frightened by such strangeness, but whether it was the mammoths or their riders that scared him was hard to say. Even Ghost backed off a step, baring his teeth in a silent snarl. The direwolf was big, but the mammoths were a deal bigger, and there were many and more of them. Jon took the horse in hand and held him still so he could count the giants emerging from the blowing snow and pale mists that swirled along the milkwater. He was well beyond 50 when Tormund said something and he lost the count. There must be hundreds. No matter how many went past, they just seemed to keep coming. In Old Nan's stories, giants were outsized men who lived in colossal castles, fought with huge swords, and walked about in boots a boy could hide in. These were something else, more bear-like than human, and as woolly as the mammoths they rode. Seated, it was hard to say how big they truly were. 10 feet tall maybe, or 12, Jon thought. Maybe 14, but no taller. Their sloping chest might have passed for those of men, but their arms hung down too far, and their lower torsos looked half again as wide as their upper. Their legs were shorter than their arms, but very thick, and they wore no boots at all. Their feet were broad splayed things, hard and horny and black. Neckless, their huge heavy heads thrust forward from between their shoulder blades, and their faces were squashed and brutal. Rats' eyes, no larger than beads, were almost lost within folds of horny flesh, but they snuffed constantly, smelling as much as they saw.
Larger and stronger than the biggest man, probably able to shadow even Gregor Clegane, the giants are a useful addition to Mance's collected host, to say the least. While the Last of the Giants song conveys the diminishment of the species, there are still enough around to have an impact on the main story. With the giants and children of the forest we see north of the Wall, George is showing us what's left of the original native inhabitants of Westeros before the coming of First Men and then the Andals.
As Jon gets to know the free folk, he sees another side to the giants, who are known for their belligerence and ferocity south of the Wall, to the relative few who actually believe in their existence, that is. In a scene with Tormund acting as a cultural guide, Jon sees Mag the Mighty, the leader of the giants, laughing after sharing a joke with Tormund. Slightly more nuanced than what one might expect from a species characterized as perennially aggressive monsters.
And the giants are able to express themselves in the old tongue, again adding to the sense that they are far from being the all-out monsters from old Nan stories. They seem shy and peaceful enough when not roused to anger, but as Sir Patrick of King's Mountain later finds out, it's best not to provoke them, unless you don't mind being battered around like a rag doll.
But while nobody in their right mind would want to come into conflict with the giants, Mance knows how useful they can be in a host gearing up for battle. According to Val, there are around 200 giants and 80 mammoths in Mance's host, so it's fortunate that the beleaguered Night's Watch have a 700-foot ice wall to hide behind.
Another group in Mance's host, not a clan or other species as such, but let's call them a magical group, are the Skin Changers. We briefly mentioned the possible origins of the Skin Changer abilities in humans earlier, saying that the free folk seem to have a higher rate of Skin Changers among their ranks, so let's take a look at the characters we know of who can inhabit the bodies and minds of animals.
There's Barrock and his fearsome boar, Goat Girl Grisella, and Briar the Shadowcat Skin Changer. Then there's Orell, the Eagle King, Varamir's Six Skins with his host of a half-dozen animals, and of course, the A Dance with Dragon prologue mentions Varamir's mentor, Hagen. It's noted in that prologue that Hagen took him to meetups of free folk skin changers, which we dubbed the Skin Changers Convention in our patron-exclusive episode about Varamir. We get this from that prologue. Once, when Lump was 10, Hagen had taken him to a gathering of such. The wargs were the most numerous in that company, the Wolf Brothers, but the boy had found the others stranger and more fascinating. Barrock looked so much like his boar that all he lacked was tusks. Orell had his eagle, Briar had a shadowcat, the goat woman Grisella. None of them had been as strong as Varamir Sixskins.
So it's interesting to consider this culture of skin changing within the free folk. Having an actual skin changers convention not only shows us that there are plenty of them out there, but that they apparently treat the lifestyle as a sort of magical craft, perhaps looking to pick up tips and tricks to further their own abilities and avoid pitfalls. But what use could Mance find for these gifted few?
Well, skin changers of high ability could serve a variety of purposes. We see Orell spying inside his eagle before he dies and becomes one with the bird, and Varamir takes over. Then there's the practical advantages. Wargs can inhabit their wolves and hunt deer to feed hungry mouths, and find other resources to sustain the massive host. We actually see this in action in Bran's dance arc.
And last but not least, there's the advantage of controlling fearsome animals in battle. In A Storm of Swords, Varamir surrounds himself with 6 bonded animals, 3 wolves, a snow bear, a shadow cat, and Orell's eagle. Would anyone want to face him on the battlefield?
Altogether, Mance's host is a diverse group to say the least, containing a number of subgroups within the free folk culture, with different religions, languages, ways of life, and even magic. This attention to detail adds the usual verisimilitude to George's world building, while also adding tension to the plot when the host first attacks the wall, then comes through it. And of course, this diverse group becomes an integral part of the northern plot when Jon joins their ranks as Mance plans to take them south past the wall one way or another.
And speaking of Mance Rayder, up next, we'll take a close look at the Free Folk's charismatic leader and the latest man to become the king beyond the wall. Why did Mance desert?
For a wench, some say. For a crown, others would have it. He liked women, Mance did, and he was not a man whose knees bent easily, that's true. But it was more than that. He loved the wild better than the wall. It was in his blood. He was wildling born, taken as a child when some raiders were put to the sword. When he left the Shadow Tower, he was only going home again.
Was he a good ranger?
He was the best of us, and the worst as well.
In terms of historic characters, Mance Rayder has the most in common with Bael the Bard. Both are charismatic musicians, ready to scale the wall and infiltrate Winterfell and display their natural leadership as kings beyond the wall. Put them side by side and you can clearly see Bael's influence on Mance, although perhaps, from the author's point of view, it might be the reverse.
As we heard in the opening quote, Mance was wildling born, taken as a child when some raiders were put to the sword. It's perhaps interesting that the one person who actually states that Mance's father was a man of the watch is Selyse Baratheon, when trying to frame her favourite wildling, Gerrit Kingsblood, as the rightful king beyond the wall. In the absence of Mance himself, or someone who knew him well like Corin Harfand, confirming this information, we'd forgive anyone who chose to take the words of Selyse, noted bastard hater, with a grain of salt. In any case, Mance was clearly always one of the free folk in his heart.
But now let's consider Craster, whose parents were known to be a mix of free folk and Night's Watch. In A Storm of Swords, Ygritte tells Jon Snow, Craster's more your kind than ours. His father was a crow who stole a woman out of White Tree Village. But after he had her, he flew back to his wall. She went to Castle Black once to show the crow his son, but the brothers blew their horns and run her off. Craster's blood is black, and he bears a heavy curse.
So Mance was taken in and raised by the Watch, while Craster was sent away by them. It's interesting then that the free folk view Mance as one of them, and Craster as more your kind than ours. And can we blame them? Nobody in their right mind would want to be associated with Craster. Living in his keep in the woods, the man leads a despicable life, marrying his own daughters and granddaughters, creating an endless cycle of incest. There are many dark characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, but he's surely one of the very worst.
And if keeping 19 daughter wives wasn't sick enough, when Jon speaks to the pregnant Gilly in A Clash of Kings, she reveals yet more horror. He asks her if it's Craster that's making her afraid, and she replies, For the baby, not for me. If it's a girl, that's not so bad. She'll grow a few years and he'll marry her. But Nella says it's to be a boy, and she's had 6 and knows these things. He gives the boys to the gods. Come the white cold, he does, and of late it comes more often. That's why he started giving them sheep, even though he's a taste for mutton, only now the sheep's gone too. Next, it will be dogs, till... She lowered her eyes and stroked her belly. What gods? John was remembering that they'd seen no boys in Craster's keep, nor men either, save Craster himself. The cold gods, she said, the ones in the night, the white shadows.
And just in case there's any doubt that the White Shadows are the others, following the mutiny at Craster's in A Storm of Swords, we get this passage in a Samwell Tarly POV. Gilly was crying. Me and the babe, please, I'll be your wife, like I was Craster's. Please, Sir Crow, he's a boy, just like Nella said he'd be. If you don't take him, they will. They? Said Sam, and the raven cocked its black head and echoed. They. The boy's brothers, said the old woman on the left. Craster's sons. The white cold's rising out there, Crow. I can feel it in my bones. These poor old bones don't lie. They'll be here soon. The sons.
In handing his sons over to the others, given that they're called out as the boys' brothers, it appears that Craster is replenishing their ranks perhaps for the first time since the Long Night, thousands of years ago. Although how long he's been at this gruesome practice is anyone's guess. Given Craster's evident age, that particular timeline has the potential to raise serious questions about how long the others have been active beyond the wall in the modern era. If, as many assume, the others were awoken relatively recently by a significant event such as the birth of the prince who was prophesied to destroy them once and for all, what was Craster up to in all the years before that? And what happened to any sons that were born to his older wives? The Craster enigma honestly raises more questions than can be answered, and so, of course, we can only hope that the Winds of Winter will bring us more information.
At the Fist of the First Men, the Night's Watch are served a taste of the others' power, with the cold gods decimating their camp, raising the fallen Black Brothers as undead slave soldiers, swelling an ever-growing psionically controlled army of whites, fated to one day attack the wall. It could well be that the cause of a new long night that will bring terror and devastation to Westeros is rooted in Craster's choices.
Given that Craster seems to be more or less shunned by other free folk, perhaps it's no surprise that it's him that the Night's Watch depend upon for shelter and information north of the wall. As a pariah of sorts, Craster would also be somewhat dependent on the rewards given to him by the Watch. In A Clash of Kings, the Night's Watch, great ranging, arrives at Craster's keep seeking assistance. Craster begrudgingly allows them to shelter on his property, with Lord Commander Mormont gifting him a new axe as part of the quid pro quo.
The Night's Watch are fully aware of Craster's daughter-wife policy, but choose to turn a blind eye because they value his strategic hospitality so much. He also divulges invaluable information about the King Beyond the Wall. Mormont tells Jon Snow that Craster said much and more last night and confirmed enough of my fears to condemn me to a sleepless night on his floor. Mance Rayder is gathering his people together in the Frostfangs. That's why the villages are empty. It's the same tale that Sir Dennis Mallister had from the wildling his men captured in the Gorge. But Craster has added the where, and that makes all the difference.
With Craster refusing to join Mance and giving his location away to the Watch, it seems he prefers the Men in Black to the King Beyond the Wall, a fact later underscored by Jon when he tells Samwell, Craster had no love for Mance, nor Mance for Craster. It's interesting to consider that the Watch counts Craster for a friend and Mance as an enemy, when the former is creating the real enemy, the others, and the latter is trying to get his people away from them. Of course, the Watch initially appear to be unaware of both of those things, so perhaps they can be forgiven for making this mistake, but for the reader it's plain to see the layers of irony deftly woven into the triangle formed by the Watch, Mance, and Craster.
Altogether, it's clear Craster is a man who insists on living on his own terms, beyond the arm of any higher authority, which includes any free folk leaders. Now let's look at Mance's tale to Jon Snow of how he joined the Free Folk to see if there are any points of comparison. One day on arranging, we brought down a big fine elk. We were skinning it when the smell of blood drew a shadow cat out of its lair. I drove it off, but not before it shredded my cloak to ribbons. Do you see? Here, here, and here. He chuckled. It shredded my arm and back as well, and I bled worse than the elk. My brothers feared I might die before they got me back to Maester Mullin at the Shadow Tower, so they carried me to a wildling village where we knew an old wise woman did some healing. She was dead, as it happened, but her daughter saw to me, cleaned my wounds, sewed me up, and fed me porridge and potions until I was strong enough to ride again. And she sewed up the rents in my cloak as well, with some scarlet silk from a shy that her grandmother had pulled from the wreck of a cog washed up on the frozen shore. It was the greatest treasure she had, and her gift to me. He swept the cloak back over his shoulders. But at the Shadow Tower, I was given a new wool cloak from the stores, black and trimmed with black, to go with my black breeches and black boots, my black doublet and black mail. The new cloak had no frays, nor rips, no tears, and most of all, no red. The men of the Night's Watch, dressed in black, Sir Dennis Mallister reminded me sternly, as if I had forgotten. My old cloak was fit for burning now, he said. I left the next morning for a place where a kiss was not a crime, and a man could wear any cloak he chose.
Mance's story is one of freedom. He treasured a black cloak with red threads that held a deep symbolic meaning to him, yet the Watch wanted to burn it because it broke their rules of uniformity. The Night's Watch is an institution where vows are held as sacred, and to be fair to Mance, he hadn't come to the Wall of his own accord, but been taken in as a child. It's clear he craved freedom, and when he got a taste, he wanted more.
So there's a definite romance in Mance's view of the Free Folk. Those north of the Wall take great pride in the fact they do not answer to a higher authority and despise the act of passively kneeling to an overlord. With Mance's tale in mind, one can see their point of view. After all, who likes being told what to do?
However, George evens out the scales with Craster. In opposition to Mance's romantic view of a lawless society, Craster represents the darker side. In a world with little authority, unscrupulous citizens can take advantage. Nobody in story, including the Watch, has ever tried to stop Craster from marrying his own daughters. His sense of freedom has driven his worst impulses to create a sick, incestuous community at his keep, and there are no checks in place to stop that from happening.
While Craster enjoys this limitless freedom, what about his daughters? Can we really say they are free folk when they've been shaped from birth to live a life revolving around their patriarch's disgusting sexual impulses? It's clear Craster's lawlessness has created a prison of sorts for his victims, and his reign only ended when the Night's Watch mutineers murdered him, ironically after fleeing the others, who it seems might be Craster's sons.
In the others, we see a group that makes conflicts between the free folk look petty by comparison, as it does the endless infighting south of the Wall. If a new long night occurs, which seems highly likely, humans had better find a way to put aside their grievances or face certain doom. One character who understands this urgency is Mance Rayder himself. So let's talk about his quest of uniting the tribes.
Mance had spent years assembling this vast plodding host, talking to this clan mother and that magnar, winning one village with sweet words and another with a song and a third with the edge of his sword, making peace between Harmer Dogshead and the Lord of Bones, between the Hornfoots and the Night Runners, between the walrus men of the frozen shore and the cannibal clans of the great ice rivers, hammering 100 different daggers into one great spear, aimed at the heart of the Seven Kingdoms.
As we've discussed, the storyline to the far north is initially colored by our bias towards the Starks and the Night's Watch. We're meant to perceive the so-called wildlings as dangerous outliers that might threaten the characters we love. When Lord Commander Mormont hears of Mance's gathering while at Craster's, he says, "I can see only one purpose in this gathering. Mance Rayder means to strike south into the Seven Kingdoms."
But the big question is why? Initially, it seems to the characters in-universe that Mance is planning an invasion for invasion's sake. The Free Folk have a long history of breaching the wall in small groups and raiding the north, so it doesn't seem unreasonable for those south of the wall to reach this conclusion.
However, the reader knows from the opening prologue that the others are back and are ready for conflict. And when a small band of Night's Watch deserters and Free Folk are confronted fleeing south, Bran meets Osha of the Free Folk. She tells him of the dangers of the others, saying, "Mance thinks he'll fight, the brave, sweet, stubborn man, like the White Walkers were no more than rangers, but what does he know? He can call himself King Beyond the Wall all he likes, but he's still just another old black crow who flew down from the Shadow Tower. He's never tasted winter. I was born up there, child, like my mother and her mother before her and her mother before her. Born of the Free Folk. We remember."
There's an irony to Osha paraphrasing the well-known phrase used so often by Northmen, "we remember," while the North forgetting the threat posed by the others is such a strong theme throughout the books. Given it's been as much as 8,000 years since the Long Night, perhaps it's understandable that the Watch is now squarely focused on the Free Folk, while Ned Stark remains in denial about the situation in the Haunted Forest, despite Garrett's eyewitness account. Osha tells Bran, "I tried to tell your lordling brother, only yesterday when I saw him in the yard. My Lord Stark, I called to him, respectful as you please, but he looked through me, and that sweaty oaf, Great John Umber, shoves me out of the path. So be it. I'll wear my irons and hold my tongue. A man who won't listen can't hear."
And if we take Osha's word as the truth, it seems that Mance was initially planning to gather the Free Folk in order to confront the others in a showdown. What might have changed his mind is a mystery, but given we learn even the giants are afraid of the others, whatever it was seems to have made him realize that the best chance for his people was to flee south.
But the Night's Watch doesn't recognize his true motivation and intention. Seeing the aftermath of the others' attack at the Fist of the First Men, Mance realized two things: that the others were capable of mass devastation and that the Watch were at their weakest. Rather than try to negotiate with the Watch, he decided to attack the wall.
And the battle at the wall will be covered in depth in a follow-up episode where we'll cover the full lead-up, the skirmish at Castle Black, the main battle when giants riding mammoths assault the wall, and the complex aftermath that continues to weave on through A Dance with Dragons and is primed to spill into The Winds of Winter.
And so, skipping over the battle at the wall for now, let's round out today's episode by discussing the Free Folk's greater role in the story.
Free folk and kneelers are more like than not, Jon Snow. Men are men and women women, no matter which side of the wall we were born on. Good men and bad, heroes and villains, men of honor, liars, cravens, brutes. We have plenty, as do you.
With Free Folk history, culture and roles in the main series covered, and the ultimate thrust of their plot points to be examined in a later episode, let's conclude today's episode by considering their role in A Song of Ice and Fire from a meta perspective. What do the Free Folk bring to our pages, and why did George choose to include them?
To begin with, there's the time capsule element we've discussed. Those north of the wall offer the reader a glimpse into the past, which helps to link ancient history to the modern day and increases the depth and realism of the world.
We're given the initial impression that the Free Folk are so different, but as we turn the pages we realise they actually have plenty of common ground with Northerners. In that sense they serve as dummy antagonists, as George attempts to withhold the others from the story as much as possible to give them a greater impact toward the end of the story. Gradually we realised the Free Folk, Night's Watch and Winterfell should all be on the same side if humanity is to keep the White Walkers at bay.
And so George shows us the diversity of culture beyond the wall, as well as dropping we're not so different comparisons as he begins to encourage empathy toward the free folk. As we heard in the opening quote, Val tells Jon Snow, good men and bad, heroes and villains, men of honor, liars, cravens, brutes, we have plenty, as do you. And Mance Rayder lets Jon know that there's more commerce between the Black Brothers and the Free Folk than you know, highlighting the commonalities and proving both sides of humanity at the Wall can work together. The real enemy is the others, and after 8,000 years, humans need to wake up and remember that people are people, no matter where they stand.
And of course, the best perspective we have on the Free Folk is through Jon Snow's eyes. Jon is one of the saga's main characters, and George chooses to tie his arc to the Free Folk. First of all, Jon joins the Watch in a Game of Thrones, which is all essentially set up for his longer-term story of joining the Free Folk and seeing the world through their eyes before trying to unite two fiercely opposed cultures.
To make the Free Folk seem like a real faction in a lived-in world, George describes different clans within the Free Folk, as we've discussed. But of course, to make the factions live and breathe, he needed an intriguing cast of characters that the reader could love and hate in some cases to give us an emotional attachment.
One of the first characters to take a shine to Jon and form bonds with him is Tormund Giantsbane. Tormund is a character beloved by fans and for good reason. He guides Jon through the experience of joining the Free Folk and is ready to defend him when others in the camp are suspicious of his Night's Watch background. George increases our emotional connection by giving Tormund the gift of the gab. He's constantly talking and telling tall tales that denote him as a somewhat comic character in contrast to the bleakness of his surroundings. Take this scene with Jon as they ride together in a storm of swords. "Is it true you killed a giant once?" he asked Tormund as they rode. Ghost loped silently beside them, leaving paw prints in the new fallen snow. "Now why would you doubt a mighty man like me? It was winter and I was half a boy and stupid the way boys are. I went too far and my horse died and then a storm caught me. A true storm, not no little dusting such as this. Har! I knew I'd freeze to death before it broke, so I found me a sleeping giant, cut open her belly and crawled up right inside her. Kept me warm enough, she did, but the stink near did for me. The worst thing was, she woke up when the spring come and took me for her babe. Suckled me for 3 whole moons before I could get away. Har! There's times I miss the taste of giant's milk, though."
And Tormund continues the farcical story when Jon asks about his nickname, Giantsbane. In response to Jon's query about whether he killed the giantess, Tormund replies, "I never did, but see you don't go spreading that around. Tormund Giantsbane has a better ring to it than Tormund Giantsbabe, and that's the honest truth of it." Much later in A Dance with Dragon, Jon will revive the joke with his now close friend and advisor over a skin of mead, telling him, "You're a good man, Tormund Giantsbabe, for a wildling."
And if Tormund brings a note of comedy, it's Ygritte who provides the romance. Jon finds her as fierce as he does beautiful, albeit a suitably rough and wild form of beauty. As Jon falls for her, he loses some of himself. Or is it that he finds a part of himself? Having sworn vows of celibacy, Jon initially fends off her advances until she traps him into proving his loyalty to the Free Folk by sleeping with the enemy. After that, Jon's resistance diminishes and he finds himself suffering an identity crisis. Like an undercover operative who joins the mafia, he gets sucked into the new lifestyle and soon finds himself unsure of which side he's on. It turns out infiltrating and blending in with the Free Folk wasn't the hard part. The hard part was not becoming one of them and turning cloak like Mance himself after the culture north of the Wall began to charm him.
One subtle way George uses to let us know that Jon's heart is being pulled in 2 directions during his relationship with Ygritte is via his view of the stars visible in the night sky. First, we get this scene with Ygritte. So many stars, he thought as he trudged up the slope through pines and firs and ash. Maester Luwin had taught him his stars as a boy in Winterfell. He had learned the names of the 12 houses of heaven and the rulers of each. He could find the 7 wanderers sacred to the faith. He was old friends with the ice dragon, the shadow cat, the moon maid, and the sword of the morning. All those he shared with Ygritte, but not some of the others. We look up at the same stars and see such different things. The king's crown was the cradle, to hear her tell it, and the stallion was the horned lord.
And later Jon looks up at the same night sky and it says, Jon sat between 2 merlons with only a scarecrow for company and watched the stallion gallop up the sky. Or was it the horned lord? So the Night's Watch part of his brain knows the star as the stallion, but the free folk side of his brain calls it the horned lord. Jon is unsure of which side he's on.
And with Mance, Tormund, and Ygritte serving as the primary characters among the free folk, along with the wildling Princess Val perhaps being set up as a future love interest for Jon after Ygritte's demise, there are still many others on the minor level that help flesh out the sprawling host and give it some depth and color. Mance's chieftains and sub-leaders form a cast of memorable characters, of whom we should recognize a few.
First is Harma Dogshead, who, well, carries dogs' heads on a pole as a banner, requiring a new canine sacrifice every fortnight. She's a fearsome raider who neither man nor dog would want to mess with.
Then there's Harma's rival, Rattleshirt, the Lord of Bones, who wears human skeletal remains as armor. He's considered dangerous with a sly and cruel nature, and the fact that Mance found a way to unite him and Harma speaks volumes about Mance's leadership of the Free Folk.
Another war leader is the Weeper, the teary-eyed raider who likes to up the ante in terms of ferocity. His calling card is to blind his victims, and he carries a scythe as a weapon. With these 3 characters among Mance's chieftains, it's easy to see why George made Mance, Tormund and Ygritte lighter in tone.
With skin changers, giants, remote clans, and a host of tertiary characters, the reader gets a sense of the scale of Mance's, quote, plotting host and understands the diversity within the group. They're a ragtag bunch, and their disorganized manner is a weakness in battle, yet their solidarity and their quest to move south gives us hope that humanity can come together and oppose the others. If Mance can unite these free folk, maybe Jon Snow and all the others can band together a suitable resistance and save Westeros. The stakes couldn't be higher, and we expect to see Jon and the free folk at the heart of any final big bad showdown.
So overall, the Free Folk served Jon Snow's story, but certainly not in a passive or meaningless way. George employs strong tropes in their story, which will no doubt be bound to Jon's in the longer term. We witness the joining the tribe plot trope play out when Corrin Harfan orders Jon to join the Free Folk undercover before his death. It's a popular trope touched on in some form or another in movies like Dances with Wolves, The Last Samurai, James Cameron's Avatar, and Dune. Often when these dynamics are woven into stories, writers face justifiable accusations of utilizing white savior tropes. George wisely sidesteps this charge by giving both sides of the wall a shared ethnic history.
So now we've covered the history, culture, characters, and purpose of the Free Folk. The only thing left to cover is one of their major plot points. The thrust of the Free Folk story in the first 3 books is to attempt to escape the icy grasp of the White Walkers and head south. In the next installment of this double episode, we'll follow their journey toward the climactic showdowns at Castle Black and the Wall. We'll cover the setup, action, and the aftermath as now Lord Commander Snow allows the defeated ranks of free folk to pass through the wall to safety, causing all sorts of political headaches. All that and more will be in our look at the Battle at the Wall. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this look at the Free Folk of the North. As usual, we'll end the episode by giving credit where credit is due. Thanks to George R.R. Martin for including the folk beyond the wall, and to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production. And we want to thank our patrons from the Castle Steel level. If you enjoy the podcast, consider being a patron and you could be hearing your name here too. Our heartfelt thanks to Atori Loon, AJ, Aegon VI, Alex, Ali B, Casey, Cassandra, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Sir Clint Deandel, Courtney, David, Darian, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Diana Dane, Esme, Liza, Emily of the Eyrie, Ezra, Felix, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Ingvild, Jim McGeehan, Something Like a Lawyer, Winter's King, Red Jimbo Rivers, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Cenarion, the White Storm, Arafinwy and Glorian, Judson, Katie, Kenneth, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Kyle, Anne Hayden Jones and her husband Pip, Lena Snow, known as the Twilight Star, Lemba, Lynn, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yeen Sleepover, Lord Leighton with the Highest Tower, Mage Marmot, Monero Geek TV, Maria, Margareta, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Molly, Nimble Nick Wanairic, Peter Pebble, Peter, PJ, Paul B, Paul H, King Ray, first of his name, Richard, Rickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Larcelot of Bee Hill, Cern, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, the Peppered Knight, Terry, Sir Terence, Knight of the Cedars, Steph Lioness, Vince, Quarren Halfhand, and Yvonne. As always, let us know if I've pronounced any of your names wrong, if you have a nickname you'd prefer to use, or if you feel we've left anything out. Visit RadioWesteros.com for quick access to all our podcasts. You can also find a link to our Patreon campaign, donate via PayPal, and comment on our content there. Or find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you find your podcasts. And of course, you can connect with us via Instagram, Discord, email, or Blue Sky. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon with a new episode. Bye for now.